Where are we? Nasu drilled. The Wyvern's Rift Dookie, named for the swath of land between the Wyvern rivers. Domain of? Her Grace, Duchess Ulissa of the Hexen House of Woven Branches, established by the 5th-generation Princess of Ibris. Cassandra doled out her answer with little concentration. She did not mind the lesson, distracted instead by Tarakon's arms wrapped around her. They rode together on Ramses to lighten the load of the cart. Cassandra pressed her shoulders into Tarakon's chest, occasionally turning him a spry smile. She wished she could lighten his mood, but the swollen purple ring around his eyes stained his mood. He had been quiet for some time, but finally interrupted the lesson with his own question. Nasu, do you know how far we are from Caldara? The sky was growing pink, and the horizon would swallow the sun within the hour. They had ridden almost non-stop since their midnight escape. Their pace had grown more leisurely, but Ramses had been pushed hard for days straight. Tarakon did not know how much more the unicorn could endure. He knew even less of the Krellos. They were odd creatures, clearly amphibious. Their glossy skin was dingy yellow, pale under their belly and spotted brown down the back. The animals were almost entirely tail, thick and conical save for the flattened tip. Tarakon was not sure if the hungry look the Krellos wore was normal or simply an effect of the animal's exhaustion. It was hard to discern emotions through their thickly corrugated cheeks and their lipless mouths teeming with thick, jagged teeth. Another 3 days, I think. Nasu, you know none of us will make it that long. We will have to stop eventually. I do not want to stop here. We will eventually have to cross the superior Wyvern River, and it would be best to rest then, at the falls. Rusty commented, That is still some distance. Likely not until morning if we keep riding, Nasu added from the driver's seat. You might be right, Tarakon. We might need to stop. Ulissa has had many problems in these woods, though. We should keep riding. The night sailed in on cold breezes that whisked through the trees and washed the sky of clouds. Nasu spared the lash for the last hour, letting the Krellos meander at their own pace down the path until they refused to walk any more. The squeal of the axle waned into silence. Everyone stared blankly ahead. This was where fate had left them, the wilderness. Nasu let out a long, contemplative sigh. They had driven well into the night, far down the trail from where they began, and still there was no end. Darkness had swallowed the horizon hours ago. Everything was cast into pitch, save for a few stars whose twinkling could be made out between the leaves of the canopy. They had lost the race to the Druid Falls against the night, and now stood to lose against the Fae. Nasu could not lash the whip again. He could barely hold it. Sleepy eyes returned as he addressed them somberly. We will stay here. Do not leave the cart, and if you must, do not leave the trail. The tree line is all that stands between us and the fairies. No fire, just get to sleep. We will continue in the morning. Here, Nicken crawled into Nasu's seat. I am a night person. I will keep watch first. Nasu crawled down to the bed of the cart and wedged himself in what little space could be spared. Excuse me, Your Excellency. The formality caught Nasu's attention more than the address of the voice. Almost everyone on the cart was too closely acquainted to address him so formally. Nasu turned to the sergeant, pinned between the carriage's headboard and Eloise, who used his mass as her personal pillow. I have a boy, Daryl stuttered. A boy back home. I need to get back to him. Please. I cannot be lost to the fairy. Is there anything I can do? Is there any way I can guard myself against them? Daryl's trembling fingers were still cramped around the leather-wrapped handle of his iron short-sword. Nasu was silent for a long while, first studying the querent, then in contemplation of the answer. The question was difficult, and its answer delicate. Daryl's difficulty answering it for himself stemmed from the same reason the answer's resolution was bleak. It was uncomfortable for Nasu to articulate the fact, and uncomfortable for Daryl to hear it. Keep the boy in your heart, and that sword in your hand, and trust that the House of Hexen provides. That is all any human can do. And if I fall? I am bound to the safety of Cassandra of Hexen, came Nasu's curt reply. But, Nasu's tone softened, those who serve the house of Hexen honorably are not forgotten, and if there is nothing that can be done for you, take comfort that your son will be provided for. They both turned away from the cold truth and sought shelter in their dreams and the hope of a warm sunrise. Sunlight burst over the horizon and set the canopy ablaze. Every leaf glowed. The songbird symphony came to a crescendo with the dawn and roused everyone from their exhaustion. The quiet night made for a comfortable and satisfying sleep. Hunger replaced fear as their motivation. A peasant's breakfast of onion jelly and rendered fat on seed loaf settled both their stomachs and their doubts. They carried on, with the whine of the wheels heralding their progress. The Krellos panted and slobbered as they dragged the cart along the winding mountain paths. Ashy mildew speckled the sheets of wet brown leaves that blanketed the ground. Everyone clenched the sideboards tightly as the wheels and axles clanked and chattered over the exposed rock. The trail swerved and pitched back and forth, repeatedly crossing a stream which also sought to descend the mountain. Patches of the trail were rough with rain-washed gravel. Other stretches looked polished, but were in fact dried puddles of mud. Cakey furrows were plowed up by the wheels as they dragged through, rather than rolled over, the sludge. They followed the trickling stream downhill until its gurgle was drowned in a greater rush of water. The mountain river was a cold shade of green, and it frothed with agitation as it tripped on breaching boulders and fumbled around jutting rocks. The banks of the river were lined with surly gravel. The pebbles spat and hissed under Ramses's hooves, and defied the trees from rooting in them. The canopy could not bridge the river, and blindingly bright sunlight poured through the break in the trees to sparkle on the water's surface. The road turned to run along the river for some distance. Everyone's mouth gapped open to keep their teeth from chattering as the wheels skipped over the washed stones. More tributaries poured in from the slopes to feed the current. The river swelled and drowned the jutting rocks under quick, quiet waters. The trail turned off of the embankment and back into the woods. A distant rush could be heard beyond the horizon of the next slope. They wove down a steep drop and followed the trail as it turned back toward the river once the ground had leveled. The crash of rushing water grew louder as they again drew nearer the river. The air grew cold and foggy. Sunlight caught the mist, obscuring the distance in a blindingly bright opaque haze. The trail crossed between two planted wooden posts. Then the soppy, irregular terrain beneath the wheels was replaced with the rhythmic chatter of wooden planks. The ground gave way to the sway of a bridge. High above them, the mountain river poured over the horizon in a massive white sheet. A haze of spray drenched them in fresh, cold kisses. This was the clean wash that was lost in that heathen rain. Their gaping mouths breathed it in, drank it in. Far below them was a broad gorge cut by the cascade. Craters, carved from the river's bedrock by the torrents, pooled and flooded. Breached embankments poured water from one tub to the next down through the canyon. The river was broken. It flowed on, but instead of one stream, it was dispersed through a delta of terraces. The blue in the sky was dotted along the canyon, reflected in the circular pools that stepped down the slope. Homes were scattered among the pools. An intricate system of gutters and drains routed the water over and away from the roofs, built over drained basins to make comfortable residences. Daub and clay were built between wooden posts to build some walls, but many of the roofs served only as portcullises and awnings built before the mouths of warmly lit caves. Residents were busy beneath. Naked children bathed in pools under the sporadic supervision of mothers who crushed nuts on broad granite tablets with granite rollers. Adolescents, dressed down to breechcloths, patiently guarded the edge of the pools with spears. The silver scales of a pierced fish glinted as it flicked uselessly against the thrust. Narrow canoes, carved from single trunks, floated in the larger pools further downstream. Several of them were loaded with baskets whose teeming contents were being traded as the vessels were rowed side by side. The wagon was stopped on the far side of the gorge after a fork in the trail wove back toward the village. "We have only ridden half a day," Nasu began, "but we will stay here until tomorrow. This is the Superior Wyvern River. Welcome to the Druid village on the falls." Nasu climbed down from the carriage as a pair of men led a boy across the bridge. The men came unarmed, save for one decorative staff between them. They stood aside, letting the boy pass before them. The head of the boy was shaved, save for a black braid growing over his left ear, clasped with a hammered copper ornament. A linen skirt was intricately folded around his hips, and his arms were sleeved in hide, with the fur turned in. Racing animals were artistically stamped along the lacing of each sleeve. His soft, juvenile chest was bare, save for a necklace of oblong, translucent teal stones. It dangled from his neck as he leaned into a bow, his hands folded in a begging, receptive manner. Nasu's black robe swayed as he mimicked the gesture. The boy started to speak, but his words were enigmatic in both meaning and sound. Two voices seemed to harmonize from his single mouth, one enunciating in the alto timbre of his youth, and the other clattering like rocks dropping down a cliff. Nasu's response, with the same clicking tongue, stunned everyone. The only familiar sound was Nasu's naming of Cassandra, which drew the boy's attention to the befuddled princess. "Taumei, Cassandra of Hexen." "Tawesh," she awkwardly replied. Until this past week, she could only remember acknowledging submission to two others, her mother and black magic. Nasu continued in his multifaceted tongue, this time closing with a trilled pronunciation of Rusty. The name struck like lightning, and the men and boy dropped to prostrate themselves as Rusty climbed out from beneath the tarp. Her appearance was further heralded by a deep bellow from a horn somewhere in the village, and a great rustling followed as everyone put aside their roles to bow. The chirping of the boy's tongue succumbed to his use of the old language, which Cassandra could at least recognize. He pressed his brow to the ground, his silent prayers almost setting him to cry. Rusty knelt close to the boy, pressed a single finger to his bare head, and chattered back to him in his native tinker. It could hardly be believed that this was still Escambreco. It was given that there would be dialects over such an expanse as this country, but that these remnant occult languages could still thrive without regular use in the royal court amazed. Rusty's address to the boy freed him and the others from their demonstration. With his head still bowed, he spoke in a solemn tone that aged him. "Welcome to the Falls. We will accommodate you in any way that we can. Please come this way." "Oh," Nasu interrupted to catch the boy's smile, "if it is at all possible, I would like to trade the Krellos for unicorns." The boy chattered at one of his escorts, then replied to Nasu, "That should be no trouble. I am sure Krellos do little good in dry fields." The escort began to release the harnesses from the large amphibians. "This man can be called Claytay. He will help you trade. I hope somebody has steeds to your liking." "Go ahead, everyone," Nasu permitted. "I will join you shortly." "Nasu?" Cassandra stalled. "Let me go. I know unicorns." "So be it. Terrakan," the captain turned to the vizier, "you may carry on. I will watch the princess." "How do you say your name?" Cassandra asked as she stepped up to the druid escort. Claytay's answer seemed to incite more curiosity than it settled. The pronunciation of the name was not vastly dissimilar, only it started with a simultaneous groan and pop that Cassandra struggled to mimic, though she tried almost the entire way. Claytay repeated his answer and laughed as Cassandra tripped over both the name and the rocks. The princess, vizier, and druid walked downstream, balancing precariously on the embankments between the pools. Reeds and grasses sprouted on the edges of the calmer pools, some of them even seeming cultivated. Under the glinting surface, Cassandra could see the silver fish darting between aquatic grasses. The largest of the calmer pools was where the market canoes drifted. Claytay called out to a tall, tanned woman on one of the vessels. She punted to meet them. Claytay and the tall merchant bartered for a while before Claytay gave any interpretation. "She will take the Krellos as payment for unicorns, but wants to know how old they are first." "They were a gift from the Orcon, so I cannot say." Claytay reiterated on Nasu's behalf. The answer did not strike the druid as well, but she tied her vessel to a post and let them on. They followed a tributary into the woods where it drained into a dammed pool. Sediments and river swill coalesced into a brown muck, blanketed with green scum and trimmed with yellow reeds. The stale water left a sour odor in the air that attracted all sorts of buzzing creatures. The merchant said something, and Clété led the Krellos toward the swamp. Eagerly the bipedal amphibians crawled into the water. The merchant tapped Cassandra and Nasu on the shoulders and waved an invitation to follow her. They meandered back toward the river and up the slope on a trail. Clété interpreted while they walked. "She keeps some unicorns. They were traded a while ago and are in good health. They are not much use here, only pulling carts or sunken boats now and then. The horns come in handy for medicine, but we do not need them to clean the water for us." They came to a clearing in the woods at the base of an outcropping cliff. 2 unicorns, one cream, the other speckled a blue-gray remarkably similar to the mist, were tied by long leashes to a metal hook drilled into the stone wall. The merchant made the same clicking noise as in Clété's name, and the unicorns trotted over. "Very nice," Cassandra commented. "They are well broken." "Yes, but are they sound?" Nasu sneered. Cassandra exchanged understanding looks with the merchant, and approached the cream one first. Cassandra could not remember when riding changed from an exercise to a passion. Melanie was a few years older than she, but to have another girl in the castle was refreshing after spending days in the company of aristocratic dames. The stables had always provided so much to do, a perfect outlet for Cassandra's seemingly endless amounts of energy. Cassandra's formal training was on the saddle, not under it. That was Melanie's place. Cassandra was thankful to have someone who knew the other side of the unicorn, though. They shared one instructor, a former captain in the Order of Valish, and a lady of a township in the southeast of the country. She had been on both sides of the saddle and was well regarded by both of the girls. It was Melanie who instructed Cassandra, however, of care for the unicorns off of the saddle. Admitting Cassandra had been taught to saddle her unicorn would have demoralized expectations that someone would always serve that duty for her. The lady would not teach Cassandra herself, but found no fault if Cassandra learned on her own, and often provided time for Melanie and Cassandra to study together. Now, Cassandra's trained eye perused these pair, studying the scheme of their bodies against the hypothesis of perfection. "This one might be a little weaker. They are draft-worthy," she concluded at the side of the gray. "The shoes are fine. The pair were not exemplary, but sufficient for the task asked of the Krellos." "These are the only 2? Nasu was not convinced. Clété nodded, and Nasu resigned. "So be it, we will take them." Clété confirmed the details with the merchant, but found her quite hostile. Clété returned. "We have only given her 2 Krellos, easily the price of 1, but not both unicorns." Nasu twitched with agitation. "Well, what is her price? Bring me a parchment and I will write her a note. My signet is recognized the country wide." "She was charged with watching them by the village, and does not know their full worth. She will give them to you if the mystic deems the payment for the second is fair." "Very well," Nasu huffed, and marched back to the village. "Who is the mystic?" Cassandra asked. "The mystic is a community leader," Nasu grumbled as he stomped down the hill. "The mystic maintains order in the community, and maintains the community in the scheme of the Tawesh. The druids are obedient to a fault to black magic, which is why they pose no threat to Nier, and why she spared them from her conquest." "How will you find the mystic?" "I already know him." "You speak their language, you know their leader. They seem like only a small group of humans. How do you know so much about them?" "I lived with them." "When?" Cassandra trampled after him, more anxious now than ever. "Honestly, Nasu, you have never been this interesting. When did you live here?" "A warlock of acclaim and credit such as mine is not ignored. To climb in the prelacy required that I study here, as must all who aspire to my position. It was your mother who nominated me, and she who sent me here, hysterically, at her convenience." Nasu closed with a bitter tone. Cassandra dared not respond. They walked along a precipice. One false step, and she might fall into the tempestuous arguments that have plagued Nasu and Osmara since before she was born. They made their way back to the village over bridges and boardwalks. White waters washed over the stones beneath them. Ahead was a cluster of caves, each dressed with a wooden awning. Under one roof, in the dried basin of a pool, the coterie was seated around a table dressed with grilled fish and a dark green salad made from some aquatic grasses Cassandra had noticed earlier. "Sit down and eat, Cassandra. I will negotiate with the mystic." Curiosity longed Cassandra to stay at Nesu's side, but the vizier had grown testy, and she would not risk his company. She stepped down into the crater and squeezed herself on a bench between Terracon and Darrell. A euphoric satisfaction blinded Darrell to anything save his food, and he moaned while eating. Cassandra could not suppress the giggle until she turned to find Terracon, also very much enthralled with the dish. "It seems this fruit-glazed fish is more appetizing to your soldiers than mushrooms and cactus oil," Rusty smirked. The day had passed quicker than expected. The mountains, behind which the sun set, were far taller here than they had been at the Brownies Valley, and they easily lost an hour of full sun. Weary and satiated by their supper, the early sunset bothered no one. An easy, sudden slumber would not settle over them, however. The day had ended, but not quietly. The torrent still poured over the cliff and seemed louder than ever at dusk. The water would not sleep and teased everyone to keep its company. A candle in a paper lantern was hung over their table. It cast an ambient glow through the mist and haze, which could barely scrawl orange highlights on their faces. Darrell reclined, intent to sleep. Rusty smiled as she stared into her tea. Eloise watched the falls. More lanterns were hung from the awnings and windows, skipping fiery specks over the surface of the water and twinkling in the ripples of the falls. The herbs in Terracon's pipe burned with the same glow. Their sweet aroma wafted through the air, carrying memories of home. Cassandra pressed to try a drag, but only turned away, coughing and gagging on the bitter smoke. "You two should be getting some rest," Nesu said from behind them. "Was everything worked out?" Cassandra asked. "There were no problems. The sum is hardly substantial. It was arranging better supplies for our ride to Caldara that took some time. Orkhan left a good majority of our belongings in the forest. I wanted to make sure we had water skins, blankets, food, the essentials. We can load the cart in the morning and be on our way. I will be only too happy when we are in the company of a full military escort." "Oh," Nesu interrupted himself, "the mystic would like to see you." Cassandra was struck by the request. "When?" "Now, if you would like. Or would you prefer to wait until morning?" Any drowsiness she had was stoked conscious by her curiosity. "Where do I find him?" "Follow the path along the ridge to the base of the waterfall. There is a cave. He is in there." Cassandra turned a quick look at Terracon, but his returned, quizzical stare neither affirmed her confidence nor fueled her curiosity. This journey was hers to make alone. She smiled, excited at the prospect, and stood from the table. She walked down the narrow path that meandered along the river's embankment to the base of the falls. The trail appeared to end beside the waterfall. Closer examination, however, revealed an added depth between the water and the rock wall, wide enough for Cassandra to slip between. The roar of the waterfall was exponentially louder. She stood at the mouth of a cave, gaping with stalactite teeth. Every crevice and cranny was flooded with the echo of the crashing water to create a deep resonance, like a voice, calling. A lit torch teased at mysteries deeper in the throat. Cassandra stepped up the wooden slats laid across the slick, uneven cavern floor and descended at a low incline into the cavern. The spitting backsplash that soaked her clothes could only reach so far into the cave, and once the environment was dry, the slats were no longer needed. Fill had been poured across the floor of the tunnel to create a path trodden smooth and stable. The walls were slick and glossy, and the orange torchlight was more reflected off the wall than illuminated by it. The cave began to level off, and Cassandra could see the depths of the cave measured by the pacing of the sconces. Not far ahead was a block, with its angular highlights betraying it as manufactured rather than naturally occurring. Cassandra's approach slowed. The breathing from a body seated on the stone brought her to a full stop. The dais bore a relief of rampant animals whose artistically thick joints were diminished to mere wisps at the appendages' ends. The seat above was occupied by a man bent with age. The flickering light that danced on the seams and details did not give much away. Thin bony arms propped a staff just as thin and gnarled. His bowed head obstructed his arrhythmic wheezing. At his feet was a clay bowl. Cassandra stood before the throne and waited patiently for some sort of address. She had been summoned, and, with all due pardon for any difference in etiquette, maintained the composure expected of a lady in a Hexen court. This was a vastly different place from the halls she knew, however. Absent was the bureaucratic bustle. The strings of names attached to every face, heralded and presented in an endless parade with little time to acknowledge or recognize the subsequent from the former. There were no courtiers or applicants, only shadows to commune with. Debates were replaced with the echo of the rushing water, a stream of noise with minimal consequence to her. Maybe she should speak up. Maybe the mystic slept and expected her in the morning. I am Cassandra of Hexen, first princess in the 8th generation, and have come to seek the counsel of the mystic. I was hoping you would come still, an alto voice chirped from the shadows. Cassandra's paranoia had filled the darkness with all sorts of fantasies, but the suggestion that another person might be among them was beyond her immediate comprehension. A stolen gasp was all she could answer. The figure that crept from the shadows was short. Cassandra was too startled to recognize the voice at first, but its familiarity dawned on her as the details of the speaker were carved by the torchlight out from the darkness. It was the young boy who had first greeted her. He seated himself beside the pedestal, striking a quiet, still posture. The curl of his smile was bright even in the cave. I have come at the request of the mystic, Cassandra finally said, but he seems to be asleep. The boy burst with a quickly suppressed giggle, which continued to stain his words as he spoke. He is not the mystic. I am the mystic, the boy then added assertively. He is the oracle, and he is not sleeping, he is drunk. Cassandra studied the boy with a cocked brow. Drunk on what? A tea, made from toadstools. The echo of the rushing water drowned the old man's wheezing, but Cassandra's perked ear could almost distinguish a stammering murmur. His voice was hoarse from age, and carried an air of imminent death that drew pity from Cassandra's heart. Is he this drunk often? Should he be put to bed? They say the chair is quite comfortable. Do not worry about him. He wants to be there. That is why he drinks as much as he does. He has been this way for days. He wants to hear the voice of the Tawesh before he dies. Cassandra could not disguise her intrigue. Why are you looking like that? The boy asked. What do you mean by hear the voice of the Tawesh? The boy's smile broadened. You have pointed ears. Do you not hear the voice of black magic? Cassandra examined the man on the stone seat. His ears were not like hers, not like any witch's. The helix of his ear curled softly around. It was not folded or pulled to a point. What do pointed ears have to do with anything? His ears are not pointed. Why should he hear black magic? That is what the stories always said, that pointed ears let you hear the voice of the Tawesh. Lady Rusty has pointed ears, and she can hear black magic. Perhaps it is not because of the ear's shape. The boy hummed in contemplation, but unable to find resolution, set his curiosity aside and answered. The only way that the oracle, or any human, can hear the voice of the Tawesh is by drinking the tea. It is dangerous, though. Hearing the voice of the Tawesh is easy, but listening to and understanding it is what proves difficult. What does the Tawesh say? The Tawesh says everything, the boy replied, bewildered. If this would be the tone of all the mystic's answers, then it was clear where Nasu's curt manner came from. The boy could tell Cassandra did not gather his meaning, and supplemented. The Tawesh comments on the weather, one's health, the side a dice will fall on, and gossips with plants. Sometimes the Tawesh just makes noises, like the sounds of a sweeping broom. To hear the voice of the Tawesh is to hear everything. It can be awful, though. Most who hear the voice ignore it. They might not even know the Tawesh is speaking. Some hear only fragments, rare, appropriate suggestions, conclusions. Sometimes they're right, sometimes wrong. Not knowing makes it awful. The Taoish says things with intention, on purpose. You never know if it is lying or dictating. The voice can rarely be denied, and hearing it means likely knowing, but not knowing, and only hoping that following the voice will not lead to misfortune. Sometimes an answer is delivered. Some only hear the words, but do not know what they mean. Those people are often driven to extreme measures, seeking solace in the silence of the Vorsan, or murmuring endlessly what they hear as they try to decipher it. A mind is not that infinite, and the limitations are maddening. Others accept the impermanence of the meaning and relish in it like it was music. That is what the oracle seeks to do. If he begins to understand it, then he will repeat or describe what he hears. It can take a long time to make these discoveries, and at a great cost. The Druids have convened here because they accept that there is a role for them, and hope that in sustaining an oracle they might learn what that role is. Several oracles have left the cave never to be seen again. We believe they have found their place. We are all just tints in the spectrum. The Druids care for the oracle, and the oracle clarifies the role of the Druids to the community and the outside world. I hope one day to hear the voice of the Taoish, but first I need to learn about the creation. If I heard the voice now, it would be like being deaf and singing. I could not know, even if I did. So I have become the mystic. I translate the answers that people ask the oracle. I speak many languages. I have to, because no one knows what language the oracle will hear next. Sometimes language is not enough. That is why the Druid speaks in two parts, the throat and the tongue. Our clicks create a second layer to the meaning of words. They can even be used over other languages to help clarify meaning. It's kind of complex. I gathered, Cassandra chimed. By translating the bits and pieces of the poem of life, I can get used to the rhythm and layers and metaphor. This way I will be prepared when I take the seat. Did the oracle say I should come? Cassandra asked. He said that you would come, so I asked Nesu to ask you to come. Why should I have come? Cassandra probed. The mystic's confusion stalled his answer. Because I asked you here. But the oracle said I would come, so why did you ask? Cassandra was aware that her questions were growing complex, but it was the only way she could pin the elusive answer she sought. It was easier than waiting for you. Cassandra rolled her amethyst eyes and sighed loudly, defeated. Was this what Nesu was like at that age? Surely the boy had a motive, and settling with the idea that it was beyond her grasp shook Cassandra to her very core. She would not settle. She then cast a devious, cunning eye that bored into the boy. What difference would it have made whether you waited on my stumbling in or my acceptance of your invitation? There might not have been enough time left to ask you about your vambraces. The boy's comment struck Cassandra personally. What do you want to know about them? Do they really belong to the demon, Orkan? Yes. How did you learn that? The oracle had ranted for days about the Orkan's punishment, and finally stopped when Nesu came to haggle for the unicorns. I was fated to destroy them as part of Orkan's punishment, and have been rather attached to them ever since. Fated? But there's no such thing as fate. Now Cassandra wore the bewildered look. What about the oracle and the roles the Druids play? Well, actually, everybody has a role, the boy began. That is not fate, though. Fate is when something must happen, but only nothing must happen. The creation has allowed for anything and everything else. That anything happens is coincidence. My role as mystic is not because it was designed, but because it was needed, and I was there. You were not fated to break Orkan's cuffs. Orkan's cuffs were broken. You mistake your effort as an answer to why, when all you provided was the means by which the cuffs broke. Black magic simply played your efforts for an end. Cassandra was riled, hurt by the suggested loss of place she thought she held in black magic's heart. Why is that not the same as fate? You could have waited for Terracon to save you just as I could have waited for you to stumble in. Just as I decided to ask you here, so too did you take command and free yourself. Terracon? How did the boy know his name? Know that Terracon had been there to rescue her? That is how magic works, though, does it not? the boy accused. Coincidences between disparate concepts are correlated? You draw associations between circumstances? When there is no separation between figment and material, there can be no separation between will and means, no difference between why and how. All that matters is that it happens, that it is. The boy smiled. What an awful, amazing perspective. Yet, the mystic stalled, there is something I do not understand. Nesu is your instructor, correct? Before Cassandra could answer, the mystic interrupted his own thought. Actually, Nesu is exceptional as well. The mystic took a moment, then returned to his conversation with Cassandra. What purpose is there in Nesu's study among the Druids? Why do witches learn? Cassandra could no longer wonder at having greeted the boy as a superior. She fumbled for an answer. Nesu is my instructor. All Hierophants study with the Druids. They have to. Will you be a Hierophant? No. Then why are you learning? I have to learn, Cassandra pieced an answer together, so that I can be a better queen. Better? The boy sneered. If the witches believed in fate, then they could not do better. They would rule how they would rule, and the world would have to take it in stride. I guess accepting fate would be easy for a witch, though. They could see the results of their want immediately. It is the same hypocrisy of frauds and liars. They live in a world of rules to which they do not adhere. It is only so much more devastating because you are so innocent to it. The boy's sorrowful tone dampened Cassandra's defiance enough to let her reflect on a reply. The boy had led her to an answer, yet still she scrounged for any other hypothesis. Hands that had spent anxious nights clawing held down every other argument, fighting for her to raise her sights to the boy's rhetorical prize. She did not have the wisdom of the Druids, nor the leisure of a human, only a talent to will what was not given to her. She could tantrum against existence. How could she tantrum against existence and come into accord with it? Hypocrisy was the best result of an infinite number of bleak solutions. Only by aligning with black magic could she be better. Why then did she tantrum against existence? Magic is a crutch, Cassandra said with a downcast gaze and a broken timbre. There is no fate. I can become better. I need to put away the crutch. These were the facts. Cassandra analyzed them. I am afraid to. Magic is... Cassandra stuttered. No, magic is not all that I am. I am a witch, but it is not all that I am. I am also a princess, and a girl who can learn, and fear, and be brave enough to face those fears, the mystic chimed brightly. Everyone betrays themselves when pressed, but only a few learn from their betrayal. The boy sat with his legs crossed, smiling silently at the dour princess for a while. She spared him one short glance, but her defeat was abject, and she could not muster a word or motivate a parting. Her loss was tangible, and guilty in taking it, the boy made amends with an offering. Did you know that Nier came to the oracle? It is a common fable told to all mystics, and occasionally the oracle will slip back to that moment and recite the entire prose. The boy's delight was fueled by a second glance from Cassandra. This one interested. She came to the falls and asked how to attain black magic. The oracle replied, Esesem ne purush to koivenia. The witches will learn, then shall they have knowledge. Esesem ne purush to koivenia. The old man droned in his sleep, stealing both Cassandra's and the mystic's attentions. They broke out in laughter, which they hid behind pinched eyes and mouth-clapped hands. The boy sighed from his giggle. I have always wondered how Nier's legacy had fared. Cassandra, his tone changed suddenly, do you have a question you would like to ask the oracle? It startled Cassandra how positively anxious the boy seemed for a reply. I knew there was an oracle at the falls, but I guess it had not come to mind. I knew there was an oracle at the falls, but I guess it had not come to mind that I might be able to address him over the past 2 days. She stalled for a moment, examining what might make a worthy inquiry. With fate scratched, she knew she could not rely on insight from the future. The past was so broad that even within its confines it seemed infinite. You know, Cassandra, the Druids and witches have always had good relations. This will not have to be your only audience with the Oracle. Let go, and find solace in some current curiosity. Cassandra smiled, but this tip offered little advice. The past days had been so tangled, so many people were hurt and lost on her behalf, and their lives seemed even less the cost of the crown now that the sanctity of the witch's rule had been undermined. Those lives haunted Cassandra, and though she proudly bore the torture of black magic's curse, she could not bear the guilt of those lives. Karen had found an answer to Dion's death. Cassandra still missed parting words from her brother. Her mother would suffer at the loss of Draco. Cassandra could not bring her brother back, but maybe there was some trace of him that she could still carry back home. She lifted tear-swollen eyes to the mystic. Is there anything my eldest brother, Draco, wants to tell my mother from his death? The delighted smile of the mystic sank, and solemnly he turned to the oracle. The translation was short, but the juxtaposed clicks likely added a dimension Cassandra could not dissect. The only word she made out was her brother's name. The mystic's query riled the oracle from his slumber. He stammered as he came from his dream to stare straight into the darkness of the cave. His line of sight hovered high above Cassandra's head, as though he peered out across a panorama. The oracle's twisted cane shook beneath his leaned weight. He opened his mouth, but the only sound was a gasp, and the lapping of a tongue as bent to try and construct something. Twice the oracle moaned at the darkness, before lowering his gaze to Cassandra. They traded a long look before the oracle moaned once more. He sucked in a sharp breath and smacked his lips shut, pursing them at Cassandra. The oracle then folded himself back into his dark robes, leaned back into the shadows, and retreated into the disassociation brought on by his drink. The boy stared bewildered for a long while at the oracle on the pedestal, then grew insular with his confused attempt at a translation. The boy clicked privately to himself for a while, drawing out Cassandra's confusion. What did that mean? She asked. The boy stammered. It is hard to say. It seems as though your brother would say nothing. The dead do not speak, but they may wish to. I'm sorry, but there is nothing that your brother would say, at least not of his death. Sometimes there is something wrong with the question, and the answer is not what was sought. Perhaps if you asked again? No, Cassandra closed sternly. Surely Draco could spare some word in his absence. She swallowed her tears. I'm done here. The boy bowed with his hands outstretched in a gesture of presenting. I'm sorry. Thank you for coming and speaking with me. Thank you for hosting me. Cassandra took a customary set of steps backward before turning to walk away.